In 1832, something was recorded, not as a legend, not as a story told by someone who heard it from someone else. It appeared in what looked like an official written account, a documented report describing human remains that did not match anything considered ordinary at the time. That alone is worth pausing on, because official records, even in that era, carried a certain weight. People did not write them carelessly. And yet what this particular record described was far from ordinary. The remains, according to those who documented them, were large, significantly large. We are not talking about someone who was slightly taller than average, or a person who simply stood out in a crowd. The descriptions placed these individuals well above 7 feet in height. Some accounts were even more specific and more extreme than that. The bones, as they were described, did not fit the proportions of a standard human skeleton. The scale was different. The measurements were different. And for the people writing these accounts, that difference was clearly notable enough to document. This raises an immediate question. If human remains of this size were genuinely discovered in 1832, why do we not know more about them today? A find like that would have been extraordinary by any standard, then or now. It would have attracted attention from scientists, from institutions, from the press. It would have generated debate. It would have left a clear and traceable record. And yet when you begin to look closely at the documentation from that period, something unusual starts to emerge. The trail is difficult to follow. Not impossible, but difficult. The records that do exist from that time are incomplete in ways that are hard to explain simply by the passage of time. Some documents appear to reference other documents as their source. But when you try to locate those original sources, they are either missing or cannot be verified. This is sometimes called circular sourcing. One account points to another. That account points back to the first. Neither one provides a foundation that can be independently confirmed. In historical research, this is a significant problem. It does not necessarily mean something was fabricated, but it does mean the evidence cannot be properly evaluated. And this is where it becomes unclear. Poor record keeping was common in the 19th century. Documents were lost. Archives were disorganized. Information was passed between people without always being carefully preserved. This is a reasonable explanation for gaps in historical records. But there is something about this particular case that makes the standard explanation feel slightly insufficient. It is not just that some records are missing. It is that the pattern of what is missing and what remains raises questions that are not easy to dismiss. Think about it from a practical standpoint. If remains this unusual were discovered and documented by people in an official capacity, there would have been a natural process that followed. The bones would have been examined. They would have been stored somewhere, a museum, a university, a government facility. They would have been discussed in correspondence between scholars or officials. Some of that material would have survived. Some trace of it would still exist in accessible archives. But the physical remains themselves, if they ever existed in the way they were described, are no longer available for study. They cannot be examined. They cannot be tested. They simply are not there. Some researchers who have looked into this point to deliberate suppression as a possible explanation. The argument is that institutions, scientific, governmental, or otherwise, had reasons to ensure that certain discoveries did not become widely known. This is not as far-fetched as it might initially sound. History does contain examples of inconvenient findings being quietly set aside, not always through active conspiracy, but sometimes through simple institutional preference for established understanding. When a discovery does not fit the accepted framework, the path of least resistance is often to ignore it rather than to challenge everything that came before. But this explanation also has problems. Suppression of this scale, over this length of time, would have required coordination across many different people and institutions. That is difficult to maintain. Others argue that the reports were simply misunderstood from the beginning. In the 19th century, the science of anatomy and anthropology was still developing. People interpreting skeletal remains did not always have the training or the tools to measure accurately, to distinguish between different species, or to contextualize what they were observing. A large but otherwise normal skeleton could have been described in exaggerated terms by someone who was genuinely surprised by what they saw. Measurements could have been estimated rather than carefully taken. Descriptions could have been passed along and gradually altered as they moved from one account to the next. This is a plausible explanation, but it also does not fully account for all of the details in the original reports. What makes this case particularly difficult to resolve is the nature of the time period itself. 1832 sits in an interesting position historically. It was an era of genuine scientific curiosity and exploration, when new discoveries were being made across many fields. People were excavating ancient sites, cataloging species, and building the foundations of modern scientific understanding. At the same time, standards for documentation and verification were far less rigorous than they would later become. Extraordinary claims were sometimes accepted more readily than they would be today, and the line between genuine reporting and embellishment was not always clearly drawn. This creates a situation where it is genuinely difficult to know where to place the account. It does not fit neatly into the category of obvious fabrication. The people involved appear to have been real. The location appears to have been real. The context of the discovery, the time, the place, the circumstances, does not seem invented, and yet the evidence that would allow a definitive conclusion simply does not exist, or at least, it does not exist in a form that can currently be accessed and studied. That distinction matters. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. There is also something worth noting about what happened, or rather, what did not happen, in the years following 1832. If a discovery of this magnitude had been made and then quietly explained away, you would expect some residual activity, debate in academic circles, follow-up investigations, attempts to either confirm or disprove the original claims. Some of that did occur, but it was far less sustained than the significance of the reported discovery would seem to warrant. The story appeared, created some discussion, and then largely faded. That pattern itself is unusual. Important discoveries do not usually just disappear from the record without explanation. It is worth asking what the people who documented these remains believed they were recording. Were they describing something they genuinely did not understand? Were they reporting faithfully on what they saw, even if what they saw was later misidentified? Or were they, for reasons that are now difficult to determine, constructing a narrative that served some other purpose? None of these possibilities can be ruled out based on the available evidence, and that uncertainty is not a comfortable place to sit, but it is an honest one. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. Something was reported in 1832. The report was specific enough to include measurements, descriptions, and contextual detail. It was written in a form that at least resembled official documentation, and it described something that, if accurate, would represent a significant departure from what we understand about human anatomy and history. Whether it was accurate is a different question entirely, and one that cannot currently be answered with certainty. The investigation into this kind of material is never straightforward. It requires moving carefully between what is documented and what is not, between what can be verified and what can only be considered. It requires resisting the pull toward easy conclusions in either direction, neither accepting everything at face value nor dismissing it without proper examination. Because the truth of what happened in 1832, whatever that truth turns out to be, is buried somewhere in the gap between what was written and what can now be confirmed. And that gap is significant, not just because of what it might contain, but because of the questions it forces us to ask about how history is recorded, preserved, and passed down, about what gets kept and what gets lost, about who decides which discoveries are important enough to maintain, and which ones quietly disappear. These are not small questions. They are the kind of questions that sit beneath the surface of this entire investigation. So this is where it begins, not with answers, not with conclusions, but with a single documented account from 1832 that does not fully make sense, and with everything that becomes unclear the moment you begin to look at it closely. The paper trail is incomplete, the physical evidence is gone, and the explanations that exist do not cover everything that needs to be explained. That combination of factors is what makes this worth investigating, not because the answer is known, but precisely because it is not. To understand why the confusion around these reported discoveries runs so deep, it helps to start at the beginning, not with the bones themselves, not with the measurements or the descriptions, but with the official record, with what the documentation from that period actually says, and more importantly, with what it tries to say. Because there's a difference between a record that clearly establishes something and a record that gestures toward it without fully arriving. And when you look closely at the accounts from the early 19th century, that difference becomes very apparent, very quickly. The early 1800s in North America were a period of significant change. Settlers were moving westward in large numbers, pushing into territories that were unfamiliar to them. And as they moved, they began encountering things they did not recognize. Scattered across the eastern and central parts of the continent were earthen structures, mounds, embankments, geometric formations, burial sites that had clearly been built by human hands, but not by anyone the settlers knew or understood. These structures were sometimes enormous. Some covered large areas of ground. Others rose to considerable heights, and no one could immediately explain who had built them or why. This discovery created a wave of archaeological curiosity that spread through that era. People wanted answers. Who were the builders of these structures? How old were they? What did they represent? Expeditions were organized. Excavations were conducted. Accounts were written. And out of all of this activity, a framework gradually emerged. The structures were attributed to a broad category of prehistoric cultures, now referred to collectively as the mound builders. Ancient peoples who had inhabited North America long before European contact, and who had constructed these earthen monuments as part of their cultural and ceremonial practices. The accepted explanation today is relatively straightforward. The mound builders were not a single civilization, but a range of Native American cultures spread across different periods of time. They buried their dead within these mounds, sometimes individually, sometimes in large groups. They placed objects alongside the remains, tools, ornaments, pottery. The skeletons found within these sites belong to those populations. There is significant archaeological evidence supporting this understanding, and it is the position held by mainstream science and the academic community. That is important to acknowledge clearly, because it forms the baseline against which everything else in this investigation has to be measured. But here is where the story becomes more complicated. Within the accounts produced during those early excavations, during the active period of mound exploration in the 1820s, 1830s, and beyond, there are occasional references to skeletal remains that were described as unusually large. Not every account, not even most accounts, but enough of them, distributed across enough different locations and documented by enough different individuals, that the pattern is at least worth examining. These descriptions did not all come from the same source. They appeared in reports from different regions, written by different people in different contexts, and in several cases, the individuals writing them held positions that gave their accounts at least some degree of credibility. When these reports are raised today, the standard explanation offered is that the descriptions were the result of measurement error. The observers were untrained. The tools available in the 1830s were imprecise. People working at an excavation site, without formal scientific training, could easily misjudge the dimensions of what they were looking at. A skeleton that was somewhat larger than average might have been estimated as significantly larger. Numbers might have been approximated rather than carefully measured. Enthusiasm, surprise, or simple inexperience could have led to descriptions that overstated what was actually there. These are reasonable points. They are grounded in a genuine understanding of how observational errors occur, and they cannot be dismissed. There is also another explanation that researchers in relevant fields have noted. Skeletal material, when it has been buried for a long period of time, does not remain static. Soil conditions, moisture levels, acidity, mineral content, the pressure of the surrounding earth, can all affect how bone changes over centuries. In certain conditions, bones can shift position. They can appear to take up more space than they originally occupied. The spatial arrangement of a skeleton can become distorted in ways that affect how its dimensions are perceived when it is first uncovered. Someone excavating a burial site without specialized training might look at remains that had expanded and shifted within their burial context and arrive at size estimates that were significantly higher than the actual measurements of the living individual. This is a real phenomenon. It has been documented, and it offers a plausible mechanism for at least some of the reports in question. At first, these explanations seem to cover the problem fairly well. Untrained observers, imprecise tools, and the natural effects of long burial. Taken together, These factors could account for a meaningful portion of the unusual size reports coming out of that era. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the issue is not simply that these explanations exist. The issue is how and when they were applied. And when you look at that more carefully, a problem begins to emerge. In a number of documented cases, the explanation of measurement error or post-burial distortion was applied not after careful examination of the remains, but before it. Reports describing unusually large skeletal material were categorized and explained away at a stage when the physical evidence had not yet been thoroughly analyzed. In some instances, the remains were not preserved long enough to be studied properly. They were noted, briefly described, and then either reburied, transferred to institutions where they subsequently became inaccessible, or simply lost from the record. The explanation arrived before the examination was complete, and that sequence raises a question that is genuinely difficult to answer. Why would an explanation be applied before a proper investigation was finished? There are a few possibilities. One is simple institutional inertia, the tendency of established frameworks to absorb anomalies by fitting them into existing categories, rather than treating them as genuinely new data. When something unexpected is found, the natural response of any structured institution is to reach for the nearest available explanation and move on. This is not necessarily deliberate. It is often just how organizations and disciplines function when confronted with material that does not fit their existing models. But the effect, whatever the cause, is that the anomalous material never receives the scrutiny it might otherwise have warranted. Another possibility is that the people making these decisions genuinely believed the standard explanations were sufficient. They were not suppressing information or avoiding inconvenient truths. They simply looked at the reports, applied what they knew, and concluded that no further investigation was necessary. From their perspective, the case was closed before it was really opened. That kind of intellectual closure, even when it comes from a place of genuine confidence rather than deliberate avoidance, can result in exactly the same outcome. Evidence that needed more careful handling was handled carelessly, and once that window closes, it is very difficult to reopen. This is where the first real doubt enters the investigation, not the dramatic doubt of a conspiracy, not the kind of doubt that requires secret meetings and coordinated deception, but the quieter, more persistent doubt that comes from recognizing that a process, which should have been more careful, was not. That questions, which should have been asked, were not asked. That the standard explanations, however reasonable they may be in general, were sometimes applied in specific situations where they had not been properly tested. And that the physical evidence, which might have settled those questions, is no longer available for examination. The mound builder context matters here because it shaped the entire environment in which these discoveries were being processed. The prevailing academic and cultural interest of that era was in understanding these ancient structures and their builders, and the dominant framework for that understanding was already being constructed in real time. New discoveries were being filtered through an emerging set of assumptions about who these people were and what their remains should look like. When something did not fit those assumptions cleanly, it created a kind of interpretive pressure. The temptation was to find a way to make it fit, rather than to allow it to remain as an open question. That is not a criticism unique to that period or those individuals. It is a characteristic of how human understanding works more generally. We build frameworks. We use them to interpret new information. And when new information resists the framework usually wins, at least in the short term. The question that follows from this, in the context of the 1830s mound excavations, is whether the framework won too easily, whether the pressure to explain and categorize moved faster than the evidence actually supported. Some researchers who have examined these records carefully argue that it did. They point to specific cases where the sequence of events, discovery, brief documentation, explanation, inaccessibility, does not match what you would expect from a properly conducted investigation. They note that the explanations offered were sometimes generic rather than specific, applied as a category rather than tested against individual cases, and they observe that the people raising these concerns have not always been given a fair hearing within established academic circles. That last point is itself something worth examining, not because disagreement with mainstream conclusions is automatically valid, but because the manner in which disagreement is handled can sometimes tell you something about the underlying dynamics of the field. None of this leads to a clear conclusion. That is worth stating plainly. The existence of measurement error as a real phenomenon does not mean it explains every case. The possibility of institutional inertia does not mean deliberate suppression occurred. The gaps in the record do not tell us what was in those gaps. What they tell us is that the record is incomplete, and that some of the explanations applied to fill those gaps were applied more quickly than the evidence alone would have supported. That is not a small observation, but it is also not a final answer. It is the beginning of a much longer and more careful examination. And that examination is what this investigation is working toward, one question at a time, one uncertain piece of evidence at a time, without rushing toward conclusions that the available material does not yet support. The first real problem with these reports is not what they describe. It is how they were created. Before you can evaluate what the accounts say about the size of the bones, you have to understand the conditions under which those accounts were produced. And when you look at that carefully, the situation becomes more complicated than it might initially appear, because the documentation process itself, the system by which these discoveries were recorded and preserved, had significant weaknesses built into it from the very beginning. In 1832, there was no standardized method for recording archaeological finds in North America. There was no central institution collecting reports. There was no formal chain of custody for physical evidence. There was no agreed-upon protocol for how a discovery of this kind should be documented, verified, or preserved. The infrastructure that modern archaeology depends on, peer review, institutional oversight, standardized measurement, controlled excavation, simply did not exist in any meaningful form during that period. What existed instead was something far more informal and far more variable. When remains were discovered during this era, the people most likely to document them were whoever happened to be present or nearby. Local officials, landowners on whose property the discovery occurred, newspaper editors looking for material of interest to their readers, curious individuals with no formal training in anatomy, archaeology, or any related discipline. These were the people writing the accounts that now form the primary record of what was found. They were not scientists operating within a disciplined framework. They were ordinary people doing their best to describe something unusual with whatever tools and vocabulary they had available. That is not a criticism of them. It is simply a description of the situation. But it does create a fundamental problem for anyone trying to evaluate those accounts today. When written records pass through multiple uncertain hands before reaching any kind of permanent archive, the potential for distortion accumulates at every stage. The original observer describes what they saw. Someone else writes it down based on what they were told. That written account is copied or reprinted by another source. Each step in that chain introduces the possibility of small changes, words altered, numbers rounded, details added or dropped. By the time an account reaches a form that survives to the present day, it may have traveled a considerable distance from whatever the original observation actually was. This is not speculation. It is a well-understood feature of how historical records from that period were produced and transmitted, and it means that the written accounts we have today have to be treated with a degree of caution. All of that is the reasonable and measured view, and it provides a solid framework for skepticism. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when you actually read the accounts in question, when you sit with them and look at what they contain, something does not quite fit the explanation of simple distortion or careless exaggeration. Some of these accounts are surprisingly specific, not vague in the way that embellished stories tend to be, but detailed in ways that are harder to dismiss. Certain reports include what appear to be exact measurements, not approximations described in general terms, but specific figures attached to specific bones or specific dimensions of the skeleton as a whole. Other accounts reference multiple witnesses, people who were supposedly present at the time of the discovery and whose presence is noted by name. A few descriptions go further still, identifying the individuals involved with enough detail that they can be at least partially cross-referenced against other historical records. That level of specificity is unusual. It is the kind of detail that tends to appear in careful documentation, not in the casual retelling of something that was already unclear to begin with. This matters because of what we know about how exaggeration typically works. When people embellish or distort, they generally do so in broad strokes. They describe impressions rather than measurements. They speak in general terms. Something was very large, unusually big, unlike anything seen before. What they do not tend to do is attach precise numbers to their descriptions, name specific witnesses, or provide contextual detail that can be checked against other sources. Those features belong to a different kind of account. They belong to reporting, not storytelling. And yet these are the features present in at least some of the records from this period. That does not confirm the accuracy of what they describe, but it does make the standard explanation that these were simply errors made by untrained observers, harder to apply without reservation. Consider what internal consistency means in this context. If a single report described unusually large remains, and that report stood alone, the explanation of measurement error would be straightforward to apply. One person, working without proper tools or training, made an honest mistake. That is entirely plausible. But the situation is more complicated than that. Across the accounts from this period, there is a pattern of internal consistency within individual reports that is difficult to explain if those reports were the product of significant error or embellishment. The measurements within a given account tend to hold together. The proportions described are not random. They form a picture that is unusual, yes, but coherent. And then there is a question that becomes even harder to answer. Why do independent accounts from different locations, written by different people in the same decade, use similar language and arrive at similar descriptions? These accounts did not all come from the same area. They were not produced by the same individuals or within the same community. The people writing them had no obvious reason to coordinate their descriptions, and yet the similarities are there. Not identical, but similar enough to constitute a pattern that requires some kind of explanation. Random measurement error, applied independently by multiple untrained observers in different places, would not be expected to produce that kind of consistency. Errors tend to scatter. They do not tend to cluster around the same characteristics in the same direction across independent sources. This is not a conclusion. It is an observation, and it is an observation that points toward a question that this investigation cannot yet answer cleanly. Were these independent accounts describing something real, even if imperfectly? Or is there another mechanism, something about the cultural context of that era, the shared vocabulary of the time, the way information traveled between communities, that could account for the similarities without requiring the descriptions to be accurate? Both possibilities deserve serious consideration, and neither one can be ruled out based on what is currently available. The cultural context of the 1830s is worth pausing on here. This was a period when the idea of a lost race of giants had genuine traction in popular and semi-scholarly discourse. It was not a fringe belief, held only by eccentric individuals. It appeared in newspapers, in published books, and in the thinking of some people who would otherwise be considered serious observers of their time. The mound builder mythology, which included, for some, the idea that the builders were a people significantly different from, and physically larger than, the Native American populations of the period, was actively being constructed and circulated during these same years. That context matters. It means there was a cultural framework available that could have shaped how observers interpreted and described what they found. It could have encouraged people to see what they expected or hoped to see. But here's the problem with applying that explanation too broadly. The cultural framework does not account for everything in the record. It can explain general tendencies toward exaggeration. It can explain why some observers might have been primed to interpret ambiguous findings in a particular direction. What it does not explain easily is the specificity, the named witnesses, the exact measurements, the internal coherence of individual accounts. If someone were simply reporting what the cultural narrative told them to report, you would expect their accounts to reflect the general shape of that narrative rather than the precise, field-note quality that some of these documents display. The cultural context is relevant, but it is not a complete explanation. There is also a methodological point worth making here. When we evaluate historical accounts, we generally apply a standard that asks whether a report has the characteristics of reliable documentation or the characteristics of unreliable transmission. Specific measurements, named witnesses, coherent internal proportions, and language that reads more like a record than a story. These are typically the features we associate with more reliable accounts. They are not a guarantee of accuracy, but they are meaningful signals. And in this case, Those signals are present in at least a portion of the record. Ignoring them because the overall topic is uncomfortable, or because the standard explanation is convenient, is not a rigorous way to approach the evidence. This is where the pattern becomes genuinely difficult to set aside. It keeps appearing, across different accounts, across different locations, across different sources, with no obvious connection to one another. The specific details, the similar language, the internal consistency, these things do not behave the way simple error or embellishment would be expected to behave. They suggest something more deliberate, more observed, more grounded in actual experience, even if the accuracy of that experience cannot currently be confirmed. What exactly that means is not yet clear. What is clear is that the straightforward application of the measurement error explanation does not fully cover what is in the record. Some part of it remains unexplained, and that unexplained portion is not small enough to ignore. So the documentation process created real problems for evaluating these accounts. That is genuine and important. The lack of standardized recording, the informal chain of transmission, the untrained observers, all of this is real. But the solution to those problems is not to apply a blanket explanation without testing it against the specific features of the evidence. The accounts that survive from this period are not all the same. Some of them do show the characteristics of casual exaggeration. Others show something different, something more careful, more detailed, more consistent. Treating them all identically, without distinguishing between them, is itself a methodological choice, and it is one that leaves certain questions permanently unanswered. Those questions are still there. The pattern is still there, and it still does not fully make sense. To place all of this properly, you have to understand the world in which these discoveries were being made, not just the archaeological context, not just the question of who was documenting what and how, but the broader environment, the social, political, and physical reality of America in the 1830s, because that environment shaped everything. It shaped what was found, how it was recorded, who paid attention to it, and what happened to it afterward. And without that context, the story of these reports is missing its foundation. The United States in the 1830s was a country in rapid, sometimes disorderly expansion. The frontier was moving westward at a significant pace. New territories were being surveyed and mapped. Land that had been undisturbed for centuries, in some cases, for thousands of years, was being cleared, plowed, and built upon for the first time by European settlers. This was not a slow or careful process. It was driven by economic pressure, political ambition, and the simple momentum of a population moving outward in large numbers. Speed mattered more than precision. Getting land cleared and productive mattered more than studying what was underneath it. This is the physical backdrop against which the mound discoveries were taking place. As settlers moved through the eastern and central regions of the continent, they encountered these ancient earthen structures in significant numbers. Fields were being prepared for farming and mounds were opened. Roads were being cut through landscapes and burial sites were exposed. Construction of all kinds was disturbing soil that had not been touched since the people who built these structures had placed things within them. And because there was no organized system for handling what was found, each discovery was dealt with locally, informally, and often very quickly. What came out of the ground one day might be gone, reburied, discarded, or dispersed within days or weeks. The Smithsonian Institution, which would later become the Central American body for collecting and preserving cultural and scientific artifacts, was not established until 1846. In the 1830s, it did not exist. There was no federal agency responsible for archaeological findings. There was no national museum with the mandate and the resources to collect physical evidence from sites across the country. There was no professional class of archaeologists operating under shared standards and accountable to a common institution. What existed instead was a scattered, decentralized collection of individuals, some educated, some not, some genuinely curious about what they were finding, others simply trying to get on with the work of clearing land and building farms. Into this environment, local newspapers stepped as the primary record keepers of discovery. This is not a small point. In the absence of any formal institutional mechanism for documenting archaeological finds, it was the press that preserved much of what was observed during this period. Editors and reporters wrote up accounts of unusual discoveries, Correspondents submitted letters describing what they had found or witnessed. These articles were printed, read, and in some cases, preserved in archives that still exist today. For many discoveries from the 1830s, the newspaper account is the only surviving documentation. There is nothing else. No official report, no institutional record, just a printed page. This created an information environment that was, in a very real sense, all of those things simultaneously. It was real, because genuine discoveries were being made and genuine observations were being recorded. It was partial, because no single source captured everything, and vast amounts of material passed through without any documentation at all. It was lost, because even what was documented often did not survive in accessible form. And it was sometimes embellished, because newspapers of that era were not bound by the standards of modern journalism, and sensational material sold papers. All four of those qualities existed in the same body of records, mixed together in ways that are now very difficult to separate cleanly. But here is where the explanation becomes difficult, because this environment, chaotic, informal, unreliable in many respects, is also the environment that produced the foundational records of legitimate American archaeology. The same newspapers that are sometimes dismissed as unreliable sources when they describe unusual skeletal remains are regularly cited as credible sources when they describe other aspects of the same sites. The same informal documentation methods that are pointed to as an explanation for why giant skeleton reports cannot be trusted are the methods that produced records now treated as the basis for accepted historical knowledge about the mound builder cultures. The same period, the same sources, the same conditions, and yet the credibility of those sources is applied selectively depending on what they are being used to support. This is the inconsistency that some researchers find genuinely difficult to resolve, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment because it is more significant than it might initially appear. If the documentation methods of the 1830s were too flawed to produce reliable accounts of unusual skeletal remains, then they were too flawed to produce reliable accounts of anything. If the newspapers of that era were prone to exaggeration and error in their descriptions of bone size and human proportions, then why would their descriptions of mound construction, artifact placement, and burial practice be treated as reliable? The answer offered by mainstream scholarship is generally that reasonable scientific judgment allows us to distinguish between the plausible and the implausible within those sources. Reports that fit within established understanding are accepted. Reports that fall outside it are treated with greater skepticism. That is a coherent position, and it is not without logic. Science does and should apply higher scrutiny to claims that challenge established frameworks than to claims that confirm them. The burden of evidence for an extraordinary claim is legitimately higher than the burden for an ordinary one. But this principle, however sound in theory, creates a practical problem when applied to historical records, because it means that the very evidence which would be needed to challenge the established framework is being evaluated by a standard specifically designed to protect that framework. The unusual reports are dismissed partly because they are unusual, and because they are dismissed, they are not studied carefully enough to determine whether they actually warrant dismissal. The reasoning moves in a circle, and the physical evidence that could break that circle is no longer available for examination. Some researchers argue that this reflects entirely reasonable scientific judgment. They would say that the pattern of skepticism applied to these reports is justified, that trained professionals reviewing the available material have good reasons for concluding that the unusual size descriptions were products of error, embellishment, or the cultural biases of the period. These are serious people making a serious argument, and their position deserves respect. The mainstream scientific view on this question is not arbitrary. It is built on a substantial body of work and a genuine understanding of how archaeological evidence functions. That has to be acknowledged clearly. Others disagree. They argue that the selective application of credibility to sources from this period constitutes a methodological inconsistency that has never been fully resolved. They point to specific cases where the evidence for dismissal is thinner than the confidence with which dismissal is applied. They note that the question of why certain reports are treated as credible while others are not has never been answered in a way that fully accounts for all of the material in the record. And they observe that the distinction, whatever its basis, has significant consequences for what questions get pursued and what questions get closed before they are properly opened. This is not a small disagreement about minor historical details. It is a disagreement about the standards by which historical evidence is evaluated. What is particularly interesting is that this inconsistency was present almost from the beginning. Even in the 19th century, observers noted that the treatment of unusual findings was not always consistent with the treatment of ordinary ones. People who submitted reports describing anomalous remains sometimes found that those reports were acknowledged and then quietly set aside, while other material from the same site or the same expedition received ongoing attention. The pattern was visible to people living through it. It was not invented by later researchers looking for problems in the record. It was noted at the time by the same individuals who were producing the documentation in the first place. That is worth considering. It is also worth considering what the practical effect of this environment was on the physical evidence itself. In a context where no formal preservation system existed, where discoveries were being made faster than anyone could properly document them, and where institutional attention was distributed unevenly across different types of finds, the material that most needed careful handling was also the material least likely to receive it. Unusual discoveries, the ones that raised questions that the existing framework could not easily answer, were also the ones most likely to be dealt with quickly and informally. They did not fit the established categories. They created interpretive problems. The path of least resistance was to move past them, and in a physical environment where remains could easily be reburied, discarded, or dispersed, moving past something meant losing it permanently. The result of all this is a record that is genuinely difficult to evaluate, not because it is entirely empty, there's material there, but because what is there exists in a form that makes definitive conclusions very hard to reach in either direction. The reports are real. The sources, however imperfect, are the same sources used to build legitimate historical knowledge about this period. The inconsistency in how those sources are treated, depending on what they describe, is real and has never been fully resolved, and the physical evidence that might have resolved it is gone. These are the conditions under which this investigation is operating. Not ideal, not clean, but real. And that small inconsistency, the question of why some reports are trusted and others are not, matters more than it might seem at first glance, because how you answer it determines almost everything that follows. There is a specific case from 1833 that is worth examining in detail, not because it stands alone, not because it is the most dramatic or the most extreme example in the record, but because it illustrates something about the broader pattern in a way that is unusually clear. It is concrete enough to follow step by step, and when you do follow it step by step, the problem it reveals is harder to dismiss than a general observation about missing records or incomplete documentation. It becomes specific, and specific problems are more difficult to explain away with general answers. In 1833, just 1 year after the date that opens this investigation, a newspaper in Ohio published an account of skeletal remains that had been found near a mound excavation site. The article was not vague. It described bones of considerable size. It noted that several local men had been present at the time of the discovery, which meant there were multiple witnesses to whatever was found. It named the location where the remains had been uncovered. These are the features of a report that is trying to be specific. A named place, multiple witnesses, a description detailed enough to convey that something out of the ordinary had been observed. The article was not presented as rumor or second-hand gossip. It was presented as a factual account of something that had happened at an identifiable location. When researchers in later periods attempted to trace this report, to find what came next, to locate the physical remains, to determine whether any institution had been contacted or any follow-up investigation had been conducted, they found something that did not match what they expected. The location named in the article existed. It was a real place. The newspaper existed. It was a real publication with a verifiable history of operation during that period. Those two anchors of the story checked out, but everything that should have come after the initial report was absent. There was no second article describing what had been done with the remains. There was no record of correspondence with any scientific institution. There was no inventory of a collection, no note in an archive, no acknowledgement anywhere in the subsequent record that the discovery had been followed up on in any way. The trail simply ended. At first, This seems like it could be explained by the general conditions of the era. The 1830s were not a period of organized, systematic archaeological practice. Documentation was inconsistent. Follow-up investigations were not guaranteed. Institutions capable of collecting and preserving physical evidence were limited in number and limited in their reach. A discovery made in rural Ohio in 1833 might simply never have attracted the attention of anyone with the resources or the mandate to do something formal with it. The remains might have been reburied, or left exposed to the elements, or dispersed by the same people who uncovered them, without anyone thinking it necessary to take further action. That sequence of events is entirely plausible for that period, and if this case stood entirely alone, that explanation would probably be sufficient. But this is where it becomes unclear, because this case does not stand alone. It is not an isolated instance of a discovery that was reported and then forgotten. When you look across the accounts from this decade, across reports from different states, produced by different observers, published in different newspapers, a pattern emerges that is much harder to account for with a general explanation about poor record keeping. The pattern is this. Discoveries involving unusually large skeletal remains are reported, and then the trail ends, consistently, across multiple cases, across multiple locations, with a regularity that does not match the overall record of archaeological finds from the same period. This is the part that requires careful attention, because the absence of follow-up documentation is not a uniform feature of all discoveries from the 1830s. Other types of finds from the same period do have follow-up records. Pottery recovered from mound sites was collected, cataloged, and studied. Stone tools were examined and preserved. Standard skeletal remains, remains that fit within the expected range of human proportions, were measured, documented, and in many cases transferred to institutions where they became part of collections that still exist today. The infrastructure for doing this was limited, yes, but it functioned. It produced records. It left traces in archives that researchers can still access. The general problem of poor record keeping did not prevent ordinary finds from being followed up on. It did not prevent the development of an archaeological record that, for most categories of discovery, is reasonably traceable. The larger skeletal remains occupy a different position in that record. They are reported, and then they are gone. No collection, no correspondence, no second article, no institutional acknowledgement. The absence is not random in the way that random loss would be expected to look. Random loss, the natural attrition of records over time due to fire, flood, neglect, and simple organizational failure, tends to affect all categories of material roughly equally. It does not systematically target one specific type of find, while leaving other types largely intact. But that is not what the record from this period shows. What it shows is a pattern of absence that is specific to a specific category of discovery, and that specificity is the detail that is difficult to explain away. Consider what would normally be expected to happen when an unusual discovery was made, even in the informal environment of the 1830s. A newspaper article would be the first step, but if the discovery was genuinely significant, if the remains were as unusual as described, other things would follow naturally. Curious individuals would want to see them. Local community members would talk about them. Someone with more education or more institutional connection would eventually hear about them and want to investigate. The kind of word-of-mouth circulation that characterized information movement in that era would carry the story outward. Correspondence would be generated. Other newspapers might pick up the account, and at some point, someone with access to a scientific institution would either visit the site or request that the material be sent somewhere it could be examined properly. This is the expected trajectory, and for discoveries that generated genuine interest, this trajectory left traces. For the unusual skeletal remains, that trajectory appears to have been interrupted repeatedly. At the same point in the process, the initial report exists. What comes after it does not, and the interruption happens too consistently, across too many independent cases, to feel like random chance. Something about this specific category of discovery produced a different outcome than other discoveries from the same period. The question is what? And that question does not have a clean answer. Some researchers, looking at this pattern, argue that the most straightforward explanation is that the remains were not actually as unusual as described. If the initial reports overstated the size of the bones, if the measurements were wrong or the descriptions were exaggerated, then the absence of follow-up makes sense. Someone who knew more about anatomy than the original observer looked at the remains, determined they were ordinary, and concluded that no further action was needed. The story died because there was no story. This is a reasonable position, and it cannot be dismissed. It is consistent with what we know about the general tendency toward exaggeration in that era's popular press, and it fits within the broader framework of how measurement errors could have occurred. But there is a problem with applying this explanation uniformly. If the remains were routinely being re-examined by more knowledgeable individuals and found to be ordinary, you would expect some record of that re-examination to exist. You would expect to find accounts of people visiting the site after the initial report, measuring the bones themselves, and concluding that the original description was inaccurate. That kind of correction, the follow-up investigation that debunks an exaggerated claim, would itself be newsworthy and worth documenting. And yet those corrective records are also largely absent. It is not just that the story of the unusual remains ends. It is that the story ends without any explanation of why it ended. No correction, no debunking, no alternative account, just silence. That silence is one of the harder things to explain. In a period when newspapers were actively covering the discovery of mound sites and generating ongoing coverage of archaeological finds, the absence of any follow-up, whether confirmatory or corrective, on reports of this specific kind is a meaningful gap. It suggests that something about how these particular reports were handled was different from how other reports were handled. Whether that difference reflects deliberate decisions, institutional indifference, or something else entirely is not clear. But the difference is there, and it is consistent enough across the record to constitute a pattern rather than a coincidence. It is also worth thinking about what the witnesses to these discoveries experienced. These were not anonymous observers. In several cases, they were named. They were local men, members of communities where they were known, where their accounts carried social weight, where their word on what they had seen would have meant something. If they had reported something they genuinely believed to be significant, and then watched that report disappear without any follow-up, without any institutional response, without any visible effort to preserve what had been found, what would that have meant to them? We do not have their perspective directly, but the human dimension of this pattern is worth acknowledging. Real people reported these things, and then the things they reported vanished. What the 1833 Ohio case illustrates, and what the broader pattern reinforces, is that the absence in this record is not evenly distributed. It concentrates around a specific type of discovery. It follows a specific sequence, report, then silence. That repeats across different locations and different sources. And it does so in a period when other types of discoveries from the same environment were generating the kind of sustained documentation that allowed them to become part of the accepted archaeological record. The comparison is important, not to prove that something was deliberately suppressed, but to establish that the silence around these specific reports is not simply a product of the general conditions of the era. It is something more particular than that. And what it is exactly remains one of the questions that this investigation has not yet been able to answer. By the mid-1830s, something had shifted in the overall picture. The reports were no longer coming from a single location. They were no longer isolated incidents that could be attributed to one community, one newspaper, or one set of observers operating within a limited geographic area. Similar descriptions were appearing across multiple states, states that had limited communication with each other, states with different populations, different local cultures, and different histories of interaction with the ancient mound sites scattered across the landscape. The geographic spread of these reports is itself a detail worth examining, because it changes the nature of the problem in a way that the single-source explanation cannot easily address. Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, New York. These were not neighboring communities sharing the same local gossip. They were distinct regions, separated by considerable distance in an era when information did not travel quickly or reliably. A story circulating in one Ohio county would not automatically reach a newspaper editor in Tennessee within days or weeks. The communication networks of the 1830s were real but slow, and yet the accounts appearing across these different states during this period shared characteristics that were specific enough to be notable. Not just the general claim that something unusual had been found, but particular details that recurred across independent reports in ways that are difficult to attribute to simple cross-contamination of stories. The shared characteristics are worth laying out carefully. Across the accounts from this period and this range of locations, the remains were consistently described as having been found in or near mound structures, the same ancient earthen sites that were being excavated and studied more broadly across the region. The size of the remains was described in similar terms across different accounts, significantly above what observers considered normal, well beyond the range of ordinary human variation as they understood it. Multiple witnesses were present in nearly every case. These were not solitary discoveries made by a single person with no one else to confirm what they saw. And in nearly every case, the physical material itself followed the same trajectory. It was either not collected at all, lost at some point during transit to a location where it could be studied, or documented as having been reburied at or near the original site of discovery. That last detail, the reburial, is where the explanation starts to weaken in a significant way. And it is worth spending time on it, because it is the detail that is most difficult to account for within the general framework of 1830s archaeological practice. To understand why, you have to understand what the broader culture around archaeological finds looked like during that period. This was not an era of conservation and careful preservation for its own sake. It was an era of active collection. Museums in the eastern cities were hungry for unusual and interesting material. Private collectors paid real money for artifacts and remains that were considered significant or curious. The impulse to collect, to display, and to profit from unusual finds was strong. In some cases, stronger than any impulse towards scientific rigor or respectful treatment of what was found. Within that environment, the standard fate of skeletal remains discovered at mound sites was removal and study. Bones were taken from excavation sites and sent to institutions, or kept by the individuals who found them, or sold to collectors. This happened regularly, and without significant controversy, during this period. The remains of ancient peoples were not generally treated with the kind of care and respect that would be expected today. They were considered archaeological material, objects of curiosity and scientific interest, and they were handled accordingly. The record of this practice is well documented. Collections built on material removed from mound sites during the 19th century still exist in institutional archives and museum collections. This is what makes the reburial detail so difficult to set aside. Against this backdrop, a culture that actively collected and removed skeletal material from these sites, the claim that multiple independently discovered sets of unusually large remains were simply reburied without further study goes against the grain of everything else happening in the same environment at the same time. It is not impossible, but it requires an explanation, and that explanation has not been provided in a form that is consistent across all the cases where reburial is cited as the outcome. Some researchers have offered a specific argument to account for this. They point to the influence of local communities, particularly communities with Native American ties, who may have insisted on the respectful reburial of ancestral remains found within these sites. This is not an unreasonable argument. There were communities in this period who had meaningful connections to the mound sites being excavated, and who would have had cultural and spiritual reasons to object to the removal of human remains from those sites. In some specific cases, community pressure of this kind is documented as having influenced how discoveries were handled. The argument deserves to be taken seriously. But here is where it becomes unclear, because this explanation, however plausible in principle, was not consistently applied to other skeletal findings from the same sites. Standard remains, bones of ordinary proportions found within the same mounds, were regularly removed during this period. They were taken to institutions. They were studied. They were added to collections. If community pressure or cultural considerations were the reason that unusually large remains were reburied rather than collected, why did that same pressure not prevent the removal of ordinary remains from the same locations? Why would the community's objection apply selectively to one category of find and not to another? This inconsistency has not been explained in a satisfactory way. It is noted in the record. It is acknowledged by researchers on different sides of this question, but a complete account of it has not been offered. The geographic spread of the reports adds another layer to this problem. When similar patterns appear across Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, and New York within the same decade, the question of how to account for that consistency becomes more pressing. One explanation that is sometimes offered is cultural diffusion, the idea that the story of giant remains spread through popular media and word of mouth, and that later reports were shaped by earlier ones. People read about a discovery in one state, the argument goes, and then interpreted or described their own local finds through that lens. The cultural narrative created a template, and subsequent reports were filtered through it. This is a genuine possibility, and it cannot be entirely dismissed. Cultural templates do shape how people describe unusual experiences. The language available to an observer influences how they report what they see. If a story about unusually large remains had entered the popular consciousness of that era, and there is evidence that it had, to some degree, then subsequent observers might have reached for that existing narrative when trying to describe something that surprised them. The cultural diffusion explanation has real merit as a partial account of the pattern. At first, this seems like it might cover the problem, but there is a difficulty. Cultural diffusion tends to produce accounts that are vaguer and more uniform than the accounts that actually appear in the record. When people repeat a story they have heard, they tend to reproduce its general shape, rather than adding new and specific detail. What you would expect from culturally diffused accounts is a collection of reports that all sound essentially the same general description, the same approximate language, the same broad outlines repeated with minor variations. But that is not quite what the record shows. The accounts from different states are similar in their general characteristics, yes, but they also contain specific local details, particular locations, particular witnesses, particular circumstances of discovery, that do not fit the pattern of straightforward story repetition. They read more like independent observations of similar phenomena than like copies of a single circulating narrative. This does not resolve the question. It is entirely possible that both things were happening simultaneously, that some reports were genuinely independent observations, while others were shaped by the existing cultural narrative. Separating those two categories, given the nature of the surviving record, is probably not possible with any confidence. But the difficulty of making that separation is itself part of the problem. It means the geographic spread of similar reports cannot simply be explained away by pointing to cultural diffusion, any more than it can be simply accepted as evidence of a widespread genuine discovery. Both explanations are partial. Neither one is complete. What remains, after working through all of these considerations, is an inconsistency in the record that resists clean resolution. Reports from multiple states, sharing specific characteristics, produced by independent observers in different communities. And in nearly every case, the physical evidence that could have settled the question is gone. Reburied, lost, never collected. The pattern of absence is as geographically distributed as the pattern of the reports themselves, and the explanations offered for that absence, poor record-keeping, cultural considerations around reburial, the general informality of the era, apply unevenly when tested against the full range of what was actually happening at these sites during this period. The reburial detail keeps returning. It is the part of the record that is hardest to simply move past, because it is not just an absence of follow-up documentation. It is an active outcome, a specific decision made, in case after case, to return unusual remains to the ground rather than study them. That decision, if it happened as described, meant that the evidence was not just lost, it was deliberately placed beyond reach. Whether that decision was made for cultural reasons, practical reasons, or some other reason entirely, or whether the reburial account themselves are accurate descriptions of what actually happened, is a question that has not been answered. It has been noted, it has been discussed, but no one has yet provided a full and consistent account of why this specific category of find was treated so differently from everything else being uncovered at the same sites, during the same period, by the same kinds of people. That inconsistency exists in the record. It has been there for a long time, and it has not gone away. At this point in the investigation, enough material has been examined to step back and look at the larger shape of what the record actually shows. Individual cases are useful. Specific reports from specific locations help illustrate particular aspects of the problem. But the real significance of what is in the historical record from this period only becomes fully visible when you look at the pattern as a whole. When you stop examining individual trees and look at the forest they form together. And when you do that, something becomes clear enough to examine directly, without hedging or qualification. Across roughly a 15-year window, running from the late 1820s through the early 1840s, a repeated sequence appears in the historical record with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The sequence follows the same basic structure every time. A discovery is made. The discovery is reported, usually in a local newspaper, by an observer or a group of observers who were present at the site. The report describes remains of unusual size, significantly larger than what was considered ordinary for human proportions. And then the physical evidence disappears from the record. No collection, no institutional follow-up, no corrective account explaining why the original description was wrong. Just the initial report, and then silence. That sequence, discovery, report, unusual description, absence, is not found once or twice. It is found dozens of times across the 15-year period in question. The geographic range across which this sequence appears is part of what makes it significant. These were not reports from a single region, sharing a single newspaper network or a single community of observers. They came from multiple states. They were published in papers that had no documented connection to each other. The individuals cited as witnesses in different accounts had no obvious relationship to one another. And yet the structure of the reports, the type of site where the discovery was made, the nature of the description, the outcome in terms of physical evidence, followed the same basic pattern across all of these independent sources. Researchers who have cataloged these accounts note that the numbers vary depending on the methodology used and the sources examined. But even among historians who approach this material with significant skepticism, the repetition itself has been acknowledged. The pattern is there. The question is what it means. The most commonly offered explanation for this pattern is cultural, and it is an explanation that deserves to be taken seriously because it is grounded in real and well-documented features of the period. The 1830s and early 1840s were a time of intense public fascination with the mysterious prehistory of North America. The mound sites were a source of popular curiosity that extended well beyond academic circles. People were genuinely captivated by the idea of an ancient civilization that had built these enormous earthen structures and then vanished. That fascination created a ready audience for stories about unusual discoveries at these sites. And newspapers of that era operated in a competitive environment where attracting readers was a constant pressure. Unusual stories sold copies. Sensational material drove circulation. The incentive to print something extraordinary, whether it was extraordinary or not, was real and present throughout this period. This explanation is fair. It cannot be dismissed. The popular press of the 19th century was not bound by the standards of modern journalism, and the temptation to embellish or even fabricate material that would attract readers was a genuine feature of how many papers operated. Stories about giants, mysterious civilizations, and impossible discoveries fit perfectly within the kind of content that audiences of that era found compelling. If newspaper editors were willing to print exaggerated or invented accounts, and there is clear evidence that some of them were, then the existence of a body of reports describing unusual remains does not necessarily require those remains to have been real. The cultural explanation provides a mechanism by which the entire pattern could have been produced without any actual unusual discovery taking place. But this is where the explanation starts to introduce its own problems. Because if these reports were primarily driven by the desire to attract readers, if the underlying motive was sensationalism and the underlying mechanism was exaggeration or fabrication, then certain features of the reports would be expected to follow from that. And some of those expected features are not what the record actually shows. This is not a small technical point. It is a substantive issue with the cultural explanation that has not been fully resolved. Consider how fabrication and exaggeration tend to behave over time. When stories are invented or embellished for the purpose of attracting attention, they almost always escalate. The first account sets a baseline. Subsequent accounts, operating within the same competitive environment and the same incentive structure, try to exceed it. If a story about bones of unusual size attracted readers, The next story would describe bones that were even larger, and the one after that would go further still. This is the natural trajectory of sensational content in a competitive media environment. The descriptions become more extreme. The claims become more impossible. The narrative inflates toward the dramatic over time. But that is not what happens in the accounts from this 15-year period. When researchers examine the size estimates and descriptions across the full range of reports, the language remains relatively consistent. The measurements described are large, clearly intended to convey something significantly above ordinary human proportions. But they stay within a range. They do not escalate toward the impossible. A report from 1828 and a report from 1840, drawn from different states and different publications, describe remains in broadly similar terms. There is no progression toward increasingly extreme claims. There is no inflation of the numbers over time. The consistency holds across the period in a way that does not match the expected behavior of fabricated content operating under competitive sensationalist pressure. This is unusual, and it raises questions that the cultural explanation does not fully answer. If the reports were being invented or heavily embellished to attract readers, why did the descriptions not escalate? Why did the size estimates stay within a consistent range rather than growing more extreme over time? One possible answer is that the editors and writers producing these accounts were exercising some form of self-restraint, keeping their descriptions within bounds that felt plausible to their readers, even while inventing the underlying material. That is possible, but it introduces a level of coordinated restraint across independent, geographically separated publications that is itself difficult to account for. Why would newspapers in Indiana and Tennessee, with no connection to each other, independently choose to describe their invented discoveries in similarly measured terms? The consistency of the language is one part of this, but there is another dimension to it that is equally worth examining. The internal structure of the reports, the way the descriptions are organized, the specific details they include, the relationship between the different elements of each account, shows a kind of coherence that is more characteristic of observation than of invention. Fabricated accounts tend to be structurally loose. They emphasize the dramatic elements and thin out the supporting detail. But the accounts from this period that describe unusual remains often include contextual information, the type of site, the position of the remains within it, the surrounding material, the circumstances of the excavation. That goes beyond what would be necessary to make the story compelling. That level of structural detail suggests someone describing something they witnessed, even if their description was imperfect, more than it suggests someone constructing a narrative for effect. Some researchers argue that this distinction is not as meaningful as it appears, that skilled writers could produce structurally coherent fabrications, and that the presence of contextual detail does not constitute evidence of genuine observation. That is a fair counterargument. Writing of this kind was not technically difficult, and the presence of specific details in a report does not guarantee that those details correspond to anything real. The argument from structural coherence is suggestive rather than definitive, but combined with the absence of escalation, it adds to the sense that the cultural explanation, while valid as a partial account of the pattern, does not cover everything in the record. There is also a question about the relationship between the cultural explanation and the specific outcome that follows every report. The cultural motive, attracting readers, would have been served by the initial publication of an unusual story, but it would have been served even better by follow-up coverage. If a newspaper printed a story about extraordinary remains, and that story generated reader interest, the natural commercial response would be to continue covering the story, to send someone to investigate, to print a follow-up, to milk the content for additional circulation. That is how sensational journalism works. The story that sells papers today becomes the foundation for more stories tomorrow. And yet that follow-up coverage does not exist for these accounts. The story is published once, and then it stops. That outcome is hard to square with the sensationalist motive. If the goal was to attract readers, why not pursue the story further? This question does not have a clean answer. It is one of the details in the broader pattern that sits uncomfortably alongside the cultural explanation without fitting neatly within it. The explanation covers some of what the record shows. The competitive media environment, the popular fascination with ancient mysteries, the incentive to print unusual material. All of this is real and relevant. But it does not account for the consistency of the descriptions. It does not account for the absence of escalation. It does not account for the structural coherence of the individual accounts. And it does not account for the consistent failure to follow up on stories that, if the motive was readership, would have been worth following. What the pattern from this 15-year window ultimately shows is that the available explanations are partial. They each cover something. None of them covers everything. The cultural explanation is the most commonly applied, and it is the most comfortable to reach for because it places the entire pattern within a framework of ordinary human behavior, competitive journalism, popular fascination, the incentive to embellish. But when you test that explanation against the specific features of the record, it leaves residue. It does not absorb the pattern cleanly. Something in the details remains unexplained, and that something keeps appearing across the accounts, across the states, across the years, consistent in a way that the explanation does not fully prepare you for. The issue does not stay contained within the informal, underfunded, loosely organized world of 1830s newspaper reporting. That would make it easier to manage. If the entire body of problematic evidence could be confined to a single decade of chaotic documentation, to a period before professional institutions existed, before standardized methods were established, before anyone with real scientific training was paying close attention, then the explanations involving poor record-keeping and untrained observers would carry significantly more weight. But the issue does not stay there. It moves forward in time. And as it does, it enters a different kind of environment, one where those explanations become harder to apply. By the late 19th century, the institutional landscape around American archaeology had changed substantially. The Smithsonian Institution, established in 1846, had grown into a major national body with real resources, real staff, and a formal mandate to study, collect, and preserve material related to American history and prehistory. By the latter decades of the 1800s, the Smithsonian was actively engaged in the systematic study of North American mound sites. This was not the informal, opportunistic excavation of the earlier period. Researchers were trained. They were sent into the field with specific objectives. Their findings were compiled into reports that were submitted to the institution and archived. A professional framework had replaced the scattered, improvised documentation of the 1830s. The conditions that had previously made it easy to explain away missing evidence were no longer fully present. The Smithsonian's mound survey work during this period was substantial. Hundreds of sites across the eastern and central United States were examined. Large quantities of material were recovered, artifacts, structural features, human remains, and brought into the institutional collection. Reports were written describing what had been found at each site. The scale and systematic nature of this work represented a genuine advance over what had come before, and it produced a body of knowledge about the mound builder cultures that forms an important part of the accepted archaeological record today. This is significant. It means the Smithsonian's work from this period is taken seriously as a source of historical understanding. It is cited. It is referenced. It is treated as credible institutional documentation. And yet, within that same body of work, within those same field reports produced by those same trained researchers operating within that same professional framework, the question of unusually large skeletal remains did not disappear. It appeared, not in every report, not as a dominant theme, but in some of the Smithsonian's own field documentation from the late 19th century. There are references to remains that were described in terms that echo the earlier newspaper accounts. Remains found at mound sites. Remains described as significantly larger than ordinary. Remains that were noted, referenced in field reports, and then, in terms of the physical material itself, become impossible to account for in the current collection. This is where it becomes unclear again, and the unclarity here is of a different quality than the unclarity surrounding the 1830s newspaper reports. Those reports came from an environment where institutional absence was the norm. There was no system in place to collect and preserve material, so the absence of physical evidence from that period can be partially attributed to the absence of any mechanism for preserving it. But the Smithsonian in the late 19th century was precisely the kind of institution that existed to collect and preserve significant archaeological material. It had the infrastructure. It had the staff. It had the mandate. If unusual remains were encountered during the course of its mound survey work, The institutional expectation was that those remains would be collected, cataloged, stored, and made available for study. That is what the institution was there to do. Researchers who have gone back through Smithsonian archives from this period, looking at the original field reports, the correspondence between field researchers and the institution, the cataloging records, have noted something that raises questions. References to oversized or unusually proportioned remains appear in some of these documents. The references are not the central focus of the reports in which they appear. They are often mentioned in passing, as one observation among many from a given site, but they are there. And when those same researchers attempt to locate the corresponding physical material, the actual bones that the field reports reference, they find that it is either unaccounted for in the current collection or recorded as having been lost at some point in the institution's history. The Smithsonian's response to these observations, when the question has been raised, has generally pointed to the practical difficulties of managing a large and complex collection over a long period of time. This is not an unreasonable position. The institution has collected an enormous volume of material over its history. Cataloging systems have changed. Storage facilities have been reorganized. Labels have been lost or mislabeled. Material has been transferred between locations without always being perfectly tracked. Over the span of more than a century, with collection sizes growing and administrative systems evolving, it is genuinely possible for specific items to become unaccounted for without any deliberate action being responsible for their disappearance. Institutional collections of this scale are not perfectly organized. Losses happen. This is a real and documented feature of how large archives function over time. At first, this explanation seems sufficient for any individual case. One set of remains, referenced in a field report but missing from the current collection. That could easily be a cataloging error, a mislabeling, a transfer that was not properly documented. Take any single instance in isolation, and the institutional explanation is plausible. The problem is not with the individual cases. The problem is with the pattern across them, because when you step back from the individual instances and look at the overall shape of what is missing, a question begins to form that the case-by-case explanation does not fully address. The losses and absences are not evenly distributed across the collection. That is the detail that matters most here. If the problem were simply general institutional disorganization, the normal entropy of a large collection managed over a long period, you would expect the losses to be scattered across all categories of material roughly proportionally. Some pottery missing, some tools unaccounted for, some ordinary skeletal remains lost in transit or mislabeled in storage. The losses would affect everything more or less equally because the mechanisms producing them, cataloging errors, storage problems, administrative gaps, would not discriminate between different types of material. But that is not the picture that emerges when researchers look at what is specifically absent. The material that is disproportionately unaccounted for is the material that was described in unusual terms. The pattern of loss concentrates around the same category of find that has been disappearing from the record since the 1830s. This does not prove deliberate removal. It is important to be clear about that. The observation that a pattern of absence exists is not the same as an explanation for why that pattern exists. There are multiple possible mechanisms that could produce this outcome without requiring anyone to have made a conscious decision to suppress evidence. Institutional bias, the tendency of collection managers to prioritize material that fits within established frameworks and to deprioritize material that does not, could result in unusual items receiving less careful handling over time, simply because they attracted less institutional attention. Material that was considered anomalous or difficult to categorize might have been stored less carefully, tracked less consistently, and ultimately lost more easily than material that fit neatly into recognized categories. The pattern of loss could be a product of neglect rather than intention. That distinction matters, even if the practical outcome is the same. But here is where the explanation becomes difficult to fully accept as a complete account. Because the Smithsonian's work in the late 19th century was not characterized by casual disorganization. The researchers conducting the mound surveys were professional. The reports they produced were detailed and systematic. The institution had explicit procedures for handling collected material. Within that professional environment, The idea that a specific category of significant find would be consistently lost due to general institutional disorganization requires a more specific explanation than simply pointing to the difficulties of managing large collections. It requires identifying what specifically went wrong with these particular items, in a way that did not go wrong with the other material recovered from the same sites. That specific explanation has not been provided. The general explanation, collection management difficulties over time, has been offered, but the specific account of how these particular items, across multiple sites, across multiple field researchers, across multiple decades, all ended up unaccounted for has not been given in a form that fully addresses the pattern. And that gap in the explanation is meaningful, not because it proves something, but because it means the question has not been properly closed. The absence of a complete account is itself a feature of the record that deserves acknowledgement. The movement of this issue from the informal newspaper reports of the 1830s into the institutional records of the Smithsonian in the late 1800s is significant for a specific reason. It demonstrates that the problem cannot be contained within a single explanation tied to a single era. The informal conditions of the 1830s explained the earlier absences, but the professional conditions of the late 19th century should have produced a different outcome. They did not. The pattern persisted across the shift from informal to institutional documentation, across the development of professional standards, across the establishment of an institution specifically designed to collect and preserve exactly this kind of material. It is still the same pattern. Discovery, reference, absence of physical evidence. At what point does a repeated pattern of this kind become something worth investigating on its own terms, not as a series of individual explanations, each plausible in isolation, but as a phenomenon that requires an account of the pattern itself? That question does not have a fixed answer. There is no threshold of repetition that automatically converts a series of coincidences into something requiring a different kind of explanation. But there is a point at which the accumulation of individual explanations, each reasonable on its own, begins to feel insufficient as a collective account of everything that is missing. Whether this investigation has reached that point, and what it would mean if it had, is something that each person examining this record has to consider for themselves. What is clear is that the pattern did not end in the 1830s. It continued, and the fact that it continued into a more rigorous institutional environment, without that environment producing the expected corrective outcome, is not a small detail. It is one of the harder features of this entire investigation to set aside. At this stage of the investigation, it is worth pausing to take stock of where things actually stand. A significant amount of material has been examined. Reports from the 1830s, the geographic spread of similar accounts across multiple states, the pattern of absence that follows each discovery, the inconsistency in how sources from this period are treated depending on what they describe, and then the extension of that same pattern into the more formal institutional environment of the late 19th century, where the explanations tied to early informality should no longer have applied. All of that material is now on the table, and it is enough to ask a direct question. What are the available interpretations of everything that has been described? Not one interpretation, all of them, because there are several, and each one deserves to be examined honestly, including its strengths and its limitations. The first interpretation is the most straightforward, and it is the one held by the majority of mainstream researchers and institutions. According to this view, the reports from the 1830s and beyond were the product of their time. They were generated in a specific cultural environment, one characterized by public fascination with ancient mysteries, competitive journalism, limited scientific literacy among general observers, and a popular appetite for sensational material. Within that environment, accounts of unusually large skeletal remains were either exaggerated versions of ordinary finds, honest mistakes made by untrained observers working with imprecise tools, or in some cases, outright fabrications designed to attract readers. The absence of physical evidence, under this interpretation, is not a mystery that requires explanation. It is simply what you would expect if the things described never existed in the form they were described. Things that were misidentified or invented do not leave behind verifiable physical traces. The record is empty because the discoveries, as reported, were not real. This interpretation is clean. It is parsimonious, meaning it explains the available data without requiring the introduction of unusual or complicated mechanisms. It aligns with what we know about how journalism functioned in the 19th century and how measurement errors occurred in early archaeological work. And it is supported by the absence of confirmed physical evidence, which is a genuinely significant point. The lack of any verified skeletal remains that match the descriptions in these accounts is not a trivial gap. It is a substantial evidentiary problem for any interpretation that takes the reports at face value. The mainstream view takes that problem seriously, and that seriousness is part of what gives this interpretation its credibility. But this is where it becomes unclear, because as straightforward as this interpretation is, it struggles with certain features of the record that have been noted throughout this investigation. It struggles with the internal consistency of the reports, the fact that the descriptions do not escalate over time in the way fabricated content would be expected to behave. It struggles with the structural specificity of accounts that read more like field notes than invented stories. And most significantly, it struggles with the pattern of absence that persists even within formal institutions operating under professional standards. If the reports were simply wrong from the beginning, the institutional pattern of missing material in the late 19th century still needs to be explained. The mainstream interpretation addresses the original reports. It is less satisfying as an account of what happened within the Smithsonian's own documentation. The second interpretation is more structural in nature, and it comes from a somewhat different place. This view does not necessarily argue that all of the reports were accurate or that the remains were definitively real. What it argues is that the process by which unusual findings were handled, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was shaped by institutional tendencies that favored certain kinds of evidence over others. The argument is that findings which complicated the dominant narrative of North American prehistory were quietly set aside, not through any organized conspiracy, not through deliberate deception coordinated across multiple people and institutions, but through the natural, largely unconscious tendency of established disciplines to direct attention and resources toward evidence that confirms existing frameworks and away from evidence that challenges them. This is a serious claim. It is important to note that it is not made exclusively by popular writers or people operating outside the boundaries of academic discourse. Some credentialed researchers, people with formal training in archaeology, history, and related fields, have made versions of this argument in published work. They are not all saying the same thing, and they are not all making equally strong claims. But the general observation that institutional bias can shape what gets studied, what gets preserved, and what gets quietly deprioritized is not a fringe position. It is a recognized phenomenon in the sociology of science. Disciplines do have dominant frameworks. Those frameworks do influence what gets treated as significant and what gets treated as an anomaly to be explained away, rather than a finding to be pursued. The difficulty with this interpretation is that it is genuinely hard to prove in specific terms. Demonstrating that a general tendency toward institutional bias existed is different from demonstrating that this specific category of material was specifically affected by that bias in specific ways. The evidence for the general tendency is reasonably strong. The evidence for its specific application to the question of unusual skeletal remains is harder to establish in the kind of detailed, case-by-case way that would be needed to make the argument rigorously. Researchers who hold this interpretation often point to the pattern of missing material in the Smithsonian archives as their primary evidence. But the institution's own explanation for that pattern, collection management difficulties over time, cannot be ruled out without access to more specific information than is currently available. The second interpretation is plausible. It is taken seriously by some serious people, but it remains, as of now, difficult to prove. The third interpretation is different in character from the first two. It does not focus primarily on whether the reports were accurate or on how institutions handled the evidence. Instead, it proposes a specific mechanism by which genuine remains could have existed, been encountered by researchers or collectors, and then entered a private rather than a public record. This interpretation, sometimes described as selective preservation, suggests that some of the remains were real, were studied in some form, but were never entered into official institutional collections. The reasons offered for this vary. One version of the argument focuses on the legal and political complexity, surrounding Native American heritage. In certain periods and certain contexts, the ownership and disposition of remains found on specific lands was genuinely contested. Remains that were legally or politically complicated might have been kept out of public institutional collections, not for scientific reasons, but for reasons related to land disputes, ownership questions, or the avoidance of legal entanglement. Some researchers find this interpretation plausible as a partial account of what happened to at least some of the material. The legal and political dimensions of archaeological work in the 19th and early 20th centuries were real and genuinely complicated. Remains found on disputed land or recovered in circumstances that raised questions about who had the right to them might have been handled in informal ways that kept them out of official records. This is not impossible. It is consistent with how some other categories of sensitive archaeological material were handled during this period. But others find this interpretation too speculative, too dependent on a specific set of circumstances that has not been clearly documented in the cases in question. The argument requires a chain of events that is plausible in principle, but not yet established in specific detail. What is notable about these three interpretations, taken together, is how each of them covers a different portion of the overall problem. The first interpretation handles the original reports well, through the lens of journalistic excess and observational error. It is less satisfying as an account of the institutional pattern. The second interpretation addresses the institutional pattern directly, through the lens of disciplinary bias and framework preservation. It is harder to prove in the specific terms required. The third interpretation offers a mechanism for physical material to have existed and disappeared without institutional knowledge. It is the most speculative of the three, and the most difficult to evaluate. Each one has genuine explanatory power in some area. None of them has full explanatory power across all areas, and the gaps they each leave behind are not trivial. They are the parts of the record that remain genuinely unclear regardless of which interpretation you apply. This is an uncomfortable situation for anyone who wants a definitive answer. It would be much simpler if one interpretation clearly covered everything, if the mainstream view resolved all of the anomalies, or if the institutional bias argument explained all of the specific patterns of absence, or if the selective preservation theory provided a complete account of where the physical material went. But none of them do, and the temptation, when faced with this kind of interpretive gap, is to either settle on the most comfortable explanation and stop asking questions, or to fill the gap with something more dramatic that goes beyond what the evidence actually supports. Both of those responses are worth resisting. The first closes questions that have not been properly resolved. The second introduces claims that the available material does not justify. What the evidence actually supports is something more limited and more honest. An acknowledgement that multiple partial explanations exist, that each of them covers something real, that none of them covers everything, and that the residue left behind by all three interpretations combined is not nothing. It is a set of specific, documented observations about the historical record that do not have clean explanations. The internal consistency of the reports, the pattern of absence that persists across both informal and institutional contexts, the uneven distribution of what is missing in institutional collections. These are not manufactured problems. They are features of the actual record that any complete interpretation would need to account for. What this means for the investigation is that the question cannot be closed from any single direction. It cannot be closed by simply invoking the mainstream explanation, because that explanation leaves parts of the record unaddressed. It cannot be closed by invoking institutional bias, because that argument has not been established in the specific terms required. And it cannot be closed by the selective preservation theory, because that theory remains too speculative to carry the weight of a final account. The question remains open, not because the answer is hidden somewhere obvious, but because the available interpretations, each of them genuinely reasonable in their own way, have not yet collectively produced a full account of everything the record contains. And that is where this investigation continues. Here is where the investigation currently stands. Not at a resolution, not at a point where all of the pieces have come together into a single clear picture, but at a position where enough has been examined to state plainly what is known, what is not known, and what the distance between those two things actually looks like. That kind of honest accounting is important. It is easy, at the end of a long investigation into unclear material, to drift toward either comfortable certainty or dramatic mystery. Both of those responses misrepresent what the evidence actually shows. What it shows is something more complicated and more honest than either of those positions allows. In 1832, and across the years surrounding that date, stretching back into the late 1820s and forward through the 1830s and beyond, there are documented reports of unusually large human remains found in burial mounds across North America. That is not a claim being introduced here for the first time. It is the starting point of this entire investigation, and it is worth restating clearly as a factual baseline. These reports exist. They are in the historical record. They appeared in newspapers, in informal accounts, and eventually in the field documentation of a major national institution. They came from multiple sources. They came from multiple states. They came from individuals with different backgrounds, different levels of education, and different relationships to the sites where the discoveries were made. The reports are not all the same in quality or specificity. Some are more detailed than others. Some are more credible than others. But as a body of documentation, they exist. That is simply true. What also exists, and what has been examined at length throughout this investigation, is the absence that follows those reports. The physical evidence described in the accounts is not available for study. It cannot be located in institutional collections. It cannot be examined, measured, tested, or verified by modern methods. In some cases, the records indicate the remains were reburied. In other cases, they were described as lost in transit or unaccounted for in collection management. In others still, the trail simply ends without any explanation of what happened to the material. Whatever the specific circumstances in each individual case, the overall outcome is the same. The documentation exists. The physical material does not. And that gap between what was reported and what can now be verified is the central unresolved feature of this entire subject. The institutional record contains gaps that have been acknowledged, not only by outside researchers approaching this material critically, but in some cases by the institutions themselves. The Smithsonian's explanations for missing material from its late 19th century mound survey work point to collection management difficulties, cataloging errors, and the general challenges of maintaining large archives over long periods. These explanations are not invented. They reflect real features of how institutional collections operate. And yet, as has been noted, they apply unevenly when tested against the specific pattern of what is missing. The losses are not randomly distributed across all categories of material. They concentrate in a specific area, and that concentration, acknowledged but not fully explained, remains a feature of the institutional record that has not been resolved. The standard explanations, measurement error, exaggeration for public interest, poor record-keeping in a period before professional standards existed, are not wrong as partial accounts of what happened. Almost certainly, some of the reports from the 1830s were the product of observational error. Almost certainly, some were shaped by the cultural environment of the period, by popular fascination with ancient mysteries, and by the competitive pressures of newspaper journalism. Almost certainly, the informal documentation systems of the early 19th century allowed material to be lost and records to be incomplete in ways that would not happen within a more rigorous institutional framework. All of these factors were real. All of them contributed to the shape of the record. None of that is in dispute. The question is whether they account for the full picture. And that is where the honest answer becomes less comfortable. Because when you test those explanations against the specific features of the record, the internal consistency of the reports, the absence of escalation in the descriptions over time, the pattern of absence that persists even within formal institutional contexts, the uneven distribution of missing material in the Smithsonian archives, they do not cover everything. They cover much of it, perhaps most of it, but not all of it. There is residue. There are features of the record that the standard explanations do not absorb cleanly, and that residue is not small enough to ignore without making a deliberate choice to look away from something that has not been adequately addressed. What cannot be said with confidence is why that residue exists. This is the honest position, and it is worth stating plainly even though it is unsatisfying. The investigation has worked through the available material carefully. It has examined the reports, the institutional record, the available explanations, and the gaps between them. It has tried to apply the same standard of scrutiny to every element, neither accepting claims uncritically nor dismissing them without adequate grounds. And at the end of that process, the question of why the pattern looks the way it does remains genuinely open, not because the answer is obviously there and simply being withheld, but because the available evidence does not support a confident conclusion in any direction. Was some of this the product of an era with weak documentation standards? Almost certainly, yes. The conditions of the 1830s were genuinely unfavorable for the careful handling of unusual archaeological material. There was no system in place to ensure that significant finds were preserved and studied. There were no professional standards governing how discoveries should be documented. There were no institutions with the reach and the resources to collect material from across the country in a systematic way. In that environment, important material could easily be lost, mishandled, or simply overlooked. That is not a speculation. It is a description of how that period actually worked, and it explains a significant portion of what is missing from the record. Was some of it exaggerated for public interest? Probably yes. The newspaper culture of the 1830s had real incentives to print unusual stories and limited mechanisms for verifying what was reported. Editors made choices about what to print based partly on what would attract readers. Observers describing unusual finds could easily shade their descriptions in a more dramatic direction without intending deliberate deception. The line between honest description and unconscious exaggeration is not always clear, especially for someone without scientific training trying to describe something that genuinely surprised them. These are real mechanisms that could have produced descriptions more extreme than the underlying reality warranted. But does that account for the full picture? That is less clear. That has been the honest answer throughout this investigation, and it remains the honest answer here. The full picture includes things that the combination of poor record-keeping and journalistic exaggeration does not easily account for. It includes the internal consistency of descriptions across independent sources. It includes the persistence of the pattern into a more rigorous institutional environment. It includes the specific concentration of missing material around a specific category of find. These features remain. They have been acknowledged by researchers on multiple sides of this question. They have not been resolved. Some researchers continue to work on this material actively. They move through state archives, land records, private collections, and institutional holdings that have not been fully cataloged or made publicly accessible. They are looking for material that might provide new clarity, a field report that has not been previously examined, a collection record that fills a documented gap, a piece of physical evidence that has survived in a location where it was not expected. This work is slow. It rarely produces dramatic results, but occasionally something surfaces, a document that had not been previously connected to this subject, a reference in an archive that points in an unexpected direction, a collection record that raises a question about material previously thought to be entirely lost. And here's the thing about those occasional findings. They rarely resolve the central question. They rarely provide the kind of clear, verifiable, conclusive evidence that would allow the investigation to move from uncertainty toward an established answer in either direction. What they tend to do instead is introduce new complexity. A newly discovered document might confirm some aspects of an existing account while raising questions about others. A collection record might account for material that was thought to be lost, while leaving the circumstances of its disappearance unclear. The new findings open as many questions as they close, and the investigation continues in that condition, with more information than it had before, but not with the kind of resolution that would allow the fundamental uncertainty to be set aside. The year 1832 sits in a specific and interesting position within American history. It is not ancient. The period is not so remote that its records are inherently inaccessible or that the events it describes are beyond the reach of historical investigation. Documents from this period survive. Archives from this era are partially accessible. The people and institutions involved left traces that can, in principle, be followed. And yet the period is not fully transparent either. The records are uneven. Some aspects of it are well documented and well understood. Others are obscure in ways that have proven difficult to resolve even with sustained research effort. The questions this investigation has been working through fall into that second category. They belong to a part of the historical record that exists, but does not yield clean answers easily. The truth of what happened, what was actually found, what it actually was, what actually became of it, has not clearly emerged from the available record. That may change. New material may surface. New methods may allow existing material to be examined in ways that were not previously possible. The archive is not completely closed. Research continues, and the possibility that something genuinely clarifying will eventually be found cannot be ruled out. But that possibility is not the same as a current answer. And a current answer is what this investigation does not have. What it has instead is a carefully examined body of evidence, a set of partial explanations that each covers something real without collectively covering everything, and a set of specific questions that remain genuinely open. The pattern of absence is consistent and notable. The standard explanations are real but incomplete. The institutional record contains acknowledged gaps that have not been fully accounted for. And the distance between what was reported and what can now be verified remains the central unresolved feature of a subject that has been part of the historical record for nearly 200 years. That distance has not closed, and what lies within it, what it actually represents, is something that this investigation, having examined everything available, cannot yet say with confidence.